Hi, I'm Bill Mowry with the Navigator Church Ministries Training and Development Team. The topic we want to explore today is, walking through a staff's journey for recruiting a church to the GiDC process. So if you haven't got a copy of this, let me encourage you to go to your training notes, and there's a link there provided for you that you can go on the NCM website and download this copy as we walk through it together. Now, let me tell you a little fishing story. When my son was about 6 years old, I decided to take him fishing. And he'd never been fishing before, so I did all the basic things, taught him how to, put the bait on the end of the hook, how to cast it out in the water, and all these basic things. And so, sure enough, Jason kind of cast that first one out in the water, and within a minute, he's actually snagged a fish. And he says, "Dad, I caught something," and he's reeling it in and says, "What do I do next?" Sometimes in contacting with a pastor or a church, we've found an interest of somebody and we wonder, what do we do next? Kind of what are the next steps that we want to take with this interested pastor or church leader? And that's what we'd like to talk about today. I'm going to take you through several kind of basic steps, just walking through the paper I described, on how do you move a person from marginal interest to kind of a commitment to growing a culture of disciple making. Well, if you're looking at that paper, you'll notice that it starts with making a connection. Now, we provided some great training videos on how to connect with a church. You have training videos on developing a prospect list, on how to present your ministry to a pastor, and then the AEIOU method. And so I'll encourage you to go look at those training videos, and they're going to give you some great ideas just on how to make a connection. Now, making a connection, we found that usually starts at three levels. One is that it can be top down, pastor and his staff, can be bottom up, an interested laborer or leader within a church and that has an interest or is doing disciple making, and then kind of from the side door. This can be in through a men's ministry, a women's ministry, or maybe a small group ministry, and you're invited to come in and serve and help in disciple making in those arenas. What we found, though, over time, is that if you don't engage the pastor and the staff in disciple making is going to remain kind of a peripheral ministry of a few rather than the mainstream of the many. And so how do you move from the peripheral to the mainstream? Well, it starts with making a connection. It starts with having a plan, and that the training videos that I mentioned earlier about how to connect with pastors will give you a plan. Then as you begin to interact with pastors, you're beginning to start a conversation with the pastor or church leader. So what do you talk about with him or her? Well, we provided training in a simple little tool called Taking a Disciple Making History. So I encourage you again to watch that video, and that can be a great way just on starting this conversation with a pastor or a church leader. Now, having a conversation is a great starting point, but next is creating a sense of urgency. How do you help a pastor or a leader move disciple making kind of on the list of 15 things to do to say they're number one or the number two priority? And this means creating a sense of urgency that they're realizing, I need some help. I don't know what to do next. Well, a simple little tool that can help in doing this is what we call the Train Illustration and Church Assessment Tool. And again, we have a training video on how you could use this. It helps a pastor identify where he or she is personally in disciple making, as well as it gives them kind of a big overview of their church and where their church is in having a disciple making culture. And by walking through that process, it helps you create the sense of urgency on the part of a leader. Now, as you're creating this sense of urgency and they find that, I'd like to go a little bit further, it's at this point you need to focus on building a relationship and not selling a program. To be honest, if a pastor or a leader indicates, I really need some help, our church needs some help in disciple making, I don't present the GiDC process at this point in time. What I do is my goal is to build rapport and trust with that pastor. Because the greater the rapport and the trust, the more he's going to, or he or she is going to invite me into their ministry, and the more there is that rapport and trust, the greater the platform they're going to give me to have an influence in their church. And so at that point in time, I want to focus on building the relationship. And so how do I do this? Well, I'll ask a pastor to make a small commitment of several weeks. And that several-week commitment is walking through the ways of the alongside together. And I might say something like this. Well, Pastor, you've identified, a need on your part and on your church's part about making disciples. And what I'd like to do is walk through some material with you just to improve your disciple-making skills, because it has to start with your leadership and with your example in discipling others. We're going to get to the big picture in time, but let's talk about you and how you're doing in disciple-making. And I've got a little booklet that we use called The Ways of the Longsider. It's a 10-week process that we can walk through together that can help improve your disciple-making skills. Now, at the end of that 10 weeks, or however long it takes us for us to walk through it, is that we can then mutually decide. You might conclude that, hey, I'm not sure I really connect with this Maori guy. This hasn't been all that helpful, and let's call it a halt here. Or I could come to kind of a similar conclusion. Or, we say that, hey, I'd like to take this further. And at the end of that time, you can then decide what you'd like to do. Now, the beauty in some ways of the Ways of the Longsider is that it allows you to model the process of disciple making with the pastor. Because when you walk through the Ways of the Longsider, what are you doing? You're building a relationship with this leader. You're talking about his or her walk with God. You're talking about their prayer life. You're beginning to explore what it means to be vulnerable and transparent and to be more loving. You're talking about how to go deep in relationships. And as you talk about those things, you realize that this is happening in your relationship. You're helping a pastor to get into the Word in a way that's going to enrich his life. And you're going to be encouraging him or her to be thinking about somebody they're going to be discipling or a triad that they're going to be recruiting. So what's this doing? You're modeling the process of disciple making. That, whether the pastor may know it or not, you're coming alongside and helping to disciple him or her to be a disciple maker. So you're modeling the process. Now, I did this with a friend of mine named Rick. Rick pastors a mid-sized church in Columbus, Ohio. And we spent actually probably about 3 months walking through the Ways of the Longsider. We got sidetracked on different things, and some chapters went into 2 sessions rather than 1. And at the end of the time, Rick is discipling some men. He's actually got a little discipleship triad going on. He's never had this happen before in his entire ministry. In fact, he commented that, I can't believe that I've missed out on the importance of relationally investing in people. And he's just thrilled about what God's doing. So I asked this question. I said, Rick, how would you like to see a church filled with alongsiders, disciple makers? How would you like to see this process that we've done together be multiplied and reproduced into the greater congregation? What do you think about that idea? And he says, I'd really like to see that happen. And at that point in time, I kind of sketched out, the GiDC process, talking about the leadership core, the church culture, and the community impact. At this point in time, I would leave the pastor then with a copy of, Crockpots, Microwaves, and Disciple Making, so that he or she could read through kind of this story of a pastor and a coach, and to get kind of a visual illustration, connect with it emotionally, and what this process could look like. And so I'm kind of popping the question, how would you like to see this happen in a larger extent in your church, giving him a resource that he could use, and that gives me, again, another follow-up with this pastor on this disciple-making process. Now, what I've tried to do is to walk through kind of these 8 steps that are outlined in recruiting a church to become a growing, intentional, disciple-making church or culture. Let me just summarize with kind of 3 simple things. One is, remember that kind of these 8 steps are they're suggested steps. Nothing ever goes as planned. You just need to be flexible and kind of, trust God to walk through it. It's not going to go as you think it's going to be planned. Second is to focus on building a relationship. We're not here to sell a program or a curriculum. We want to build a relationship. So that means taking time to, build rapport, build trust, model disciple making, and invest in a life. And you're doing that right there with that pastor as you're walking through this process. And then thirdly, no matter the amount of pushback, particularly from the pastor or maybe a council or a board, just start small and go slow. Invest in this pastor's life, and maybe it's a few other selected people. Start small and go slow, so you're modeling this life. Now, just like in the Ways of the Longsider, we talk about these 5 levels of communication, how you move from cliche to information to values, and then kind of emotionally, that there's also this process in recruiting a pastor. And it starts with just meeting them and building a connection, building a rapport, investing in a life, and then asking them to make a deeper commitment. So, I want to encourage you, ask God now. Begin praying that He would lead you to a pastor or a church leader that's willing to make that commitment to have a life, somebody investing in his life so that their church could become a disciple-making church.